In this installment, we're honoured to have neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky with us to discuss his latest book, Determined. This thought-provoking book delves deep into the neurobiology of human behaviour, challenging our understanding of free will and exploring the complex interplay between biology and the environment that shapes our actions. Now, let's turn the spotlight to Mick, our founder and director, with the interview.
It's an honor to have you here with us, Dr. Sapolsky.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So to start off, I'll say I've been a determinist for about 12 years now, initially influenced by Sam Harris's book, Free Will. Your book, Determined, offers a more rigorous examination of how our actions are shaped by our biology. What inspired you to write such a comprehensive account of determinism, and how does this book fit into the broader context of your work?
Well, the problem with the book is I thought I had already written it. I had this book come out in 2017 called Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. And it was this mammoth, like almost 800-page monster thing. And its basic approach was, okay, how do we make sense of where behavior comes from? It's due to what happened in your brain a second ago. And it's due to what environmental triggers, sensory, whatever, in the last 30 seconds caused your brain to, and it's due to the hormones you have in your bloodstream this morning and your experiences in recent months and your brain plasticity and adolescence, childhood, fetal life, genes, culture, the whole shebang. And just going through, like, that's where behavior comes from. And in the aftermath of it, I would give a lot of like public lectures and stuff, and people inevitably, there's someone who would ask saying, wow, so given all of this, this suggests that there might be less free will than we normally think. I said, oh my God, no, the whole point is there's no free will whatsoever. You can, if you go through everything I just went through, that's the only possible conclusion you could reach. And it seemed inconceivable to me that this like 790-page book wound up being too subtle about this point, and like, oh Christ, I need to go back now and like write something that's explicitly saying, hey, when you put all these pieces together, there's no free will whatsoever. And all the people who are still claiming that somehow that free will is compatible with how the universe works are not making sense, and that this is actually a good thing if people like were to accept that there's no free will. So I thought I had written the book, but no, I didn't. So 5 years later, this one.
Um, Were you always a determinist, or was there a specific moment that solidified this line of reasoning for you?
Um, let's see. I became a determinist one night at around 2 in the morning when I was 14.
Hmm.
In that I was having adolescent tumult and stuff, some of it revolving around some very sort of specific free willish issues, and it was causing me a lot of distress. And one night I woke up at 2 in the morning with this utter clarity saying, oh, I get it, there's no God. And then a few seconds later I said, and there's no free will.
Hmm.
And then a few seconds after that, saying, oh, and it is completely empty and different universe. And that's kind of where I've been at ever since. And like nothing about that has budged.
Hmm.
So that in one very interesting night's neurochemistry, sort of that's where I've been ever since.
Nice. Um, and so many disagreements about free will seem to stem from semantic differences. How do you define free will, and how do you define determinism?
Okay. Maybe easiest place to start is to begin with what most people mistake for free will and where that gets people into trouble,
Mhm.
which is, every day we make choices, we have options, we form an intent about something, and decide, we choose to act upon it. We know consciously that we are choosing to act on this intent. We usually have a pretty accurate guess as to what the outcome is going to be. Most importantly, we know we don't have to do this. We could be doing that instead. We could be ordering a different flavor of ice cream than the one we just ordered, kind of thing. And thus, consciously aware, understand the outcomes, and you know you are not being coerced. And for most people, this is necessary and sufficient then for deciding that there's free will. And
Hmm.
when you think about it, like that's where the criminal justice system is at. Did the person understand what they were doing? Do they know right from wrong? Do they know the likely outcome? Did they know they could have done otherwise? Yes to all of those. They're culpable, lock them away.
Hmm.
Um, and sort of where I approach is that despite the fact that people like spending huge amounts of really smart science going into what's happening in the brain when you choose vanilla over strawberry, and what's that process about, and where's the decision making, and at what point has your brain made a decision, and at what point are you consciously aware of the brain having made a decision, and stuff about milliseconds worth of stuff happening in the brain. And people have been spending forever studying this. In my view, that has nothing whatsoever to do with free will and is interesting science, but is a complete waste of time if it's coming to the free will debate, because that doesn't address the absolutely critical question. As you sit there and you have formed the intent and you act on it and you know there's alternatives, how did you turn out to be the sort of person who would form that intent
Hmm.
at that moment? How did that happen? Which is where what was going on in your brain a second ago and this morning's hormones and back when you were a kid and your epigenetics of fetal life and all of that. And it's irrelevant to say what is the intent you formed just now and did you know you could act on it, all of that. Saying that that's enough for understanding free will is like saying you could read only the last sentence of a book and decide you know what the book is about,
Hmm.
because all that there is how did you turn out to be this sort of person? And when you look at how that works, how each of us arrived at the moment where we are, when you look at that, that kind of leads me into sort of my definition of determinism, or what free will would be in that case, is show me a neuron, show me a part of the brain, show me a brain, show me a person who has just formed an intent and acted on it. Show me that that intent was completely free of that person's history, that
Hmm.
nothing about how they came to that moment and turned out to be that sort of person had anything to do that that brain would have done the exact same thing if this morning's breakfast was different and your genome was different and your childhood traumas or lack thereof and what the humidity was out 2 weeks ago. And show me a brain, show me an action that is free from history,
Hmm.
just shown free will.
Yeah.
And you can't. Nobody can.
Yeah. So considering the complexity of brain processes, neuroplasticity, predictive decision making, and higher order of thought, did you ever think you might find a neuron acting without prior history? Did anywhere somewhere tucked in our agency?
Um, no, actually not. And if you're getting down to like the individual neuron level, some of the stuff people are fighting about when they're saying there is free will somehow lurking in there is looking at, does your brain ever do random stuff?
Hmm.
Does a neuron just ever fire from out of nowhere? Does stuff like that ever occur? That starts one whole rabbit hole to go down of, is randomness ever possible to be a basis of free will? And there's a whole branch of like libertarian, not philosophical libertarians, but not political libertarians, but philosophical, who say you can pull intent and volition out of randomness, which makes no sense to me at all, which is why the argument that free will comes from quantum indeterminacy falls apart.
Mhm.
But even assuming that, yeah, now and then a neuron does something random. Is it possible that that's the building block for your moral compass that will guide you through life? And when you look at the nuts and bolts of neurons doing random stuff, they're not really.
Mhm.
Because what you see is, under some circumstances, your brain will determine this is a good time for this part of the brain to be indeterministic. That, for example, is what dreams are. If you haven't exercised certain parts of your brain, dream stages, REM stage is a stage where your brain has determined this is a good time to shut off this part of your brain called the frontal cortex, which says, no, actually, you would not want to be able to fly in the air and breathe underwater or whatever is going on in your dream. Like, just let this part of the brain run amok for a while and do totally random stuff, which we call dream content.
Mm.
Because when you look at the structure of it, often you're exercising parts of the brain you didn't do much with during the day. And all these other circumstances where you see parts of the brain acting in a way that appears free of history is because the rest of the brain, in a deterministic way, has said, okay, let's get some indeterministic stuff out of this. Because the way you see that is when you look at the mechanisms for a neuron randomly has an action potential from out of nowhere. Ooh, that neuron just showed free will. Or if you want to get mechanistic, the way a neuron normally does an action potential, some random emergent combination of molecules or whatever, just cause that neuron to set off this action potential when no other neuron talked to it.
Mhm.
But when you look at it, no, it actually uses a different mechanism. It's not that you accidentally went and hit the button and ordered 100 pounds of marshmallows from Amazon before you knew it. You have a separate pathway by which neurons do stuff without having inputs. Ah, that sounds like a lot of planning that went into it. You had certain sort of childhood experiences, you had certain genetic makeups, and you're more likely to have neurons that do this than in other circumstances. Oh, even the way in which your brain goes about being indeterministic is shaped by your brain deciding when it's a good time for it and what the parameters are. And what comes to mind for me is, like, claiming this is free will is like signing up for an improv class, and every Wednesday night you go there to the community center and the person says, okay, so today we're going to do an exercise with this, and okay, you first come up and I want you to do a 90-second improv about it. That's what your brain is doing when it appears to be doing something random.
Mm.
And saying that, like, coming up with dialogue in an improv class has anything to do with free will is like saying that doing that in an improv class makes you like an existentialist who is doomed to be free in life. No, it's a very narrow range where your brain does this. So when you look down at the nuts and bolts of it, even the stuff that some people are willing to say, ooh, that neuron just did that, that neuron just did that as a result of evolution of that alternative pathway and long-term influences of, ooh, turns out fetal alcohol syndrome has something to do with the likelihood of spontaneous neuronal neurotransmitter release when you're an adult. Nah, nothing comes from nowhere.
Mm.
So, like, even down at that level, show me something that just occurred free of its history. And there's sort of a key thing with this that, like, on first pass, kind of what I'm saying is, okay, how do we become who we are? Ooh, we got to think about the neurobiology of a minute ago and the endocrinology of this morning and all these different disciplines. No, it's not even that you have to consider all these different disciplines. When you look at how they work, they're ultimately one discipline. If you're talking about what genes have to do with behavior, by definition, you're talking about millions of years of evolution of those genes. And by definition, you're talking about what went on when you were a fetus, when you were epigenetically programming those genes. And you're talking about what gene protein products were made in your brain this morning at 7:45 as a result of this. It forms one continuous arc of all of these different approaches blur together into one. And, at some point, a certain rhetorical pressure that's put on somebody saying there's no free will is, oh, yeah, prove it. Prove there's no free will. Prove there's no Easter bunny. Prove that there's no leprechauns that run around at night when you're asleep. That the onus of proof by now is on the people who are willing to admit this is how a neuron works, and this is how a gene works, and this is how societies form in response to ecological pressures. And that's why you got this type of society you were raised into. Somebody who can go through all of that, show me a mechanism by which this continuous arc of biological precursors interacting with environmental precursors, show me a mechanism by which that neuron just now did that completely free of that.
Hmm.
And nobody can. And there's enough science by now as to how each of these little pieces occurred that made you who you are in this instant, that show me how that could have happened, where all of this biology over which you had no control, interacting with environment over which you had no control, brought you to this moment. Show me how it works. Show me how a neuron could just get it in its head to suddenly have an action potential completely free of its history. Show me someone who has done something completely free of their childhood and adolescence and the cultural values they were raised with, and whether they couldn't stand their parents and thus they wanted to be exactly the opposite of them, or they wanted to be exactly like their parents, or they rejected. And show me any of that. Enough already with prove to us there's no free will. Show me how the brain can produce behavior that's free of everything that came before that you had no control over. So that's kind of the song and dance I go through endlessly, and that makes, by most polling, 95% of card carrying philosophers have apoplexy because they are formally compatibilists.
Hmm.
They're willing to admit that, like, the world is made of atoms and molecules and gravity exists and we've got cells in our head and all of that. They're willing to deal with like a 21st century conception of the physical laws of the universe, but somehow that's compatible with, you can still pull a rabbit out of the hat
Hmm.
and have moments where you can act free of your history. And that's what, literally, the polls show 90 to 95% of philosophers consider themselves to be deterministic compatibilists. And when you look closely at what they're saying, there's always some massive logical flaw somewhere in there that you undo that and you've torn apart the whole edifice of what they're saying.
Are they thinking that there's like some sort of missing link to free will, basically, that like that there's not a full picture of, I don't know, the turtles?
Yes, there's a bunch of different styles. There's the people who decide that free will is coming from quantum indeterminacy, and I want to scream at those people because, like, oh, please spare me from another book with a title of like quantum healing or quantum wealth or quantum magic or something, where, like, uh, by most physicists' view, not all of them still, but by most, things get very, very weird and indeterministic way down at the subatomic level. But that has absolutely nothing to do with who's going to shoplift and who's going to have a moral fiber to resist doing that. This simply cannot work that way. And there's like some technical reasons for that.
Yeah.
There's another whole school of philosophers who pull free will out of chaoticism. Um, and where they make a fundamental mistake is chaotic systems are ones that are formally unpredictable. It is possible to show it's a version of like the three-body problem in physics, where it is formally unpredictable.
Mhm.
Then the mistake they make is thinking that if something is unpredictable, it was not determined. And that's where they go off the rails. Then there's a whole school of people who look at emergent complexity, the fact that like one neuron of ours looks an awful lot like one neuron from a frog brain and isn't intrinsically fancier, and the wiring isn't fancier, and just there's this emergent thing that put 100,000 of them together and you got a frog that could do certain computational stuff with its like brain as to where it sees like a fly to go try to catch or whatever, and instead put 80 billion of them together and you get something that invents aesthetics and theology and economic views and love and all of that. And it's just with enough quantity, you invent quality. More is different. So there's a whole school of people who try to pull free will out of emergent complexity.
Mm.
One neuron doesn't have free will, but oh, put all of them together. And when you look at their model, what they're doing, their step of magic and or illogic is the belief that once you have something emergent, a whole upper level, an emergent system, something that has a property that cannot be described at the level of the simple component parts. Knowing anything about this water molecule tells you nothing about the phenomenon of wetness.
Mhm.
Wetness is an emergent property of when you put enough building blocks of things called water molecules together. And ant colonies being able to regulate the temperature in their colony, which they can do, and crazy stuff like that, is an emergent property of you take 100,000 ants, each of which has some very simple rules for how it interacts with neighbors, and put them all together, and out pops, ant sociality. And the same thing with neurons. All of the models by which emergent systems are supposedly ways in which you can get free will is once something totally cool and complex emerges on that level, like wetness or an ant society or a human brain, somehow at that point, the ants get smarter.
Mm.
They're able to do stuff that they couldn't do back when they were just single ants or 10 of them were. And somehow neurons can now function independently. And the whole point of like emergent systems like our brains is you have these building blocks that are stupidly simplistic, and all they have is a couple of rules for what they do if they bump into this ant who does this, and there's like some very simple rules, like a marching band on a field. Go this many steps and go left, and then before you know it, if everyone is doing this, out emerges the whole marching band has now made the face of Ruth Bader Ginsburg or something, and like no single individual had that information in them. Emergent stuff like that. The whole point that makes emergent systems like brains and ant colonies and all of that amazing is the building blocks are just still as stupidly simple. A
Mm.
neuron can't go backwards. A neuron can't defy gravity. A neuron can't do anything. An ant suddenly doesn't speak French once you've got enough of them together to form a colony. So all of the models where you got the philosopher saying free will is coming from emergent complexity, that one falls apart because it's all predicated on there's sort of a top-down control that you could get, which then makes the building blocks smarter. And suddenly you have neurons doing what they can't normally do. Um, and then there's just a whole hodgepodge of philosophers who say there's free will, but not there. You're looking in the wrong place. Oh, no, not there either. It's in a different place. Oh, not, but there was, which is how you got, or you're going to have free will, which is why we're going to be able to hold you responsible. But once it's the future, it's still the present that no longer has free will. But whoa, it's just sort of a shell game. And then you got the ones where ultimately someone like Daniel Dennett, who was the most sort of visible of compatibilist philosophers, when you really, really closely look at what he was saying, it would be there better be free will because it's going to be such a bummer if there isn't. You cut through everything he was saying, and ultimately, he was saying, like, would you want to live in a world in which, like, I wouldn't want to? So this has to be sufficient to explain free will. And he got on my nerves profoundly. And I had a debate with him last fall, which turned out to be one of his last debates
Mhm.
before he died, which, like, I don't think it was my fault, but whatever. And like, I vehemently disagreed with not only his thinking about this, but his sort of emotional makeup that brought him to these conclusions, which I think he was viewing free will and the reasons why people can be held responsible for their actions from a position of great self-satisfied privilege. Um, oh, damn, should I say that? The guy's dead. I felt so bad afterward that he died. But like a very privileged position of deciding people have earned what they turned out to be. But his stance was what I think is when you sift through enough stuff, where almost everyone is coming from those philosophers, which is it just feels way too upsetting. It's really a drag.
Mhm.
I, Dennett would not only say stuff like, "Whoa, if you stop believing in free will, we better continue to believe in it." If you tell people that not only would you have murderers and rapists running around on the streets, somewhat like a Trumpian view of what the world could be like, but then he would literally say things like, and what if it turns out that you didn't really earn the prize that you've gotten? That the prize that you've gotten really was not based on your hard work and self. Oh, that's really a big worry for most people on this planet, that they're going to feel demoralized and emptied out because it turned out they didn't earn their CEO salary. They didn't earn their graduate degree. They didn't earn their love or their friendships or whatever. So, ranging from, oh my God, stop talking about quantum mechanics to, wow, what a bummer it'll be if I admit there's no free will. I think that kind of covers the full range of like the 95% of philosophers who are saying somehow there's still room for free will in there.
Was it unsatisfying for you when you came to the position that there's no free will?
Um, it was simultaneously enormously liberating and depressing as hell. Because like you got your hands full at that point trying to find meaning.
Hmm.
And I've had a little more than 50 years of thinking this way, and I think I've made a couple of baby steps in the direction trying to find some fucking purpose out of all of this and meaning. um so yeah, that was, but at the same time it was kind of, oh, I get it.
Yeah.
Like, that's why some people turned out this way and other people turned out that way. And this whole attributional system that we run with actually doesn't make any sense at all. And at least you don't have to operate with that system, which is kind of what brought me this last book. I don't know, 500 pages. The first half is going through, here's all the reasons why the people who say there's free will ultimately are not making sense. And the second half of the book was, oh my God, what happens if everybody actually decided there is no free will? How are we supposed to function? What's the world supposed to look like? Where I go through, we're not going to have murderers running amok. Here's why: we're still able to change. A deterministic world does not mean nothing can change, so don't bother any of that. Um, and going through, like, okay, damn, the last chapter somehow is going to have to get around to, well, like, where do you get purpose from and meaning? And kind of the the sleight of hand I wound up with is I seemed all along sort of the conclusion to all of this is there's no free will. And you know what? Suck it up because that house works. And if you're depressed by it, tough luck. That's how the world works. You really can't have a belief system that will make electrons spin in the opposite direction of where they spin or whatever electrons do. Um, and then eventually realizing that if you're sitting around and the notion that there's no free will is a huge demoralizing bummer because where's purpose and what do I make of the fact that like I love my wife and maybe that's just mechanistic or things turned out okay and maybe I didn't earn that by definition if that's depressing to you, by definition, you're one of the lucky ones because, by definition, throughout your life, you've been being treated better than average for reasons you had nothing to do with. And for most people on this planet who, at various points, in very significant ways, are treated worse than average for reasons they had nothing to do with, all this could be is liberating. Like, you wound up with genes that made you dyslexic. You're not lazy.
Mhm.
You wound up with a variant of your leptin receptor so that your hypothalamus is unresponsive to food satiety signals. And that's why you were very overweight and you can't get the discipline to get. Ooh, you were not responsible for your depression. You were not just like self-indulgent and come on, show some tenacity like everybody else. Ooh, you're no, here's the biology of how you wound up this way and you had no control over it. And that is actually very liberating. And it's a very good thing that, like, we figured out at some point, not only isn't there free will and we could become this and anything we want to be, we could achieve, but like at some point, we figured out we don't have the power to control the weather. And thus, if there's a thunderstorm unexpectedly that ruins your crops, don't go and find the old lady living on the edge of the hamlet who everyone thinks is kind of creepy and burn her at the stake because she's a witch and she obviously had the power to affect the weather. Like, it's a good thing we figured out that brains do not make it possible for one to control the weather. And thus, it's a good idea that we don't burn people at the stake anymore. And it's a liberating thing that we don't tell kids that they're stupid and unmotivated and instead say, actually, there's this micro architectural screw up in one layer of your cortex here. And that's why you reverse the letters B and P. And that's why you had trouble learning to read, or that, or, oh, no, it's not actually your fault that you have obsessive compulsive disorder. It's not something you should be. No, here's something screwy that's going on in this one part of your brain called the basal ganglia, and you had no doubt. And each time we come up with one of these, screw it with, ooh, where do we find meaning and all of that from? It's just each time we figure out one of those, you've just freed a whole bunch of people from a sense of they somehow earned their crappy luck in life. And like over and over, you get like this 40-year-old who will say, yeah, I got my dyslexia diagnosis last year. I wish someone had tested me for that when I was 8. I've spent my whole life thinking I was lazy and unmotivated and what's wrong with me. Ooh, I've spent my whole life thinking I have an off-putting, unpleasant personality and I deserve to not have friends, when no, actually, you were on the autism spectrum. And
Mm.
that's why people always found you weird and off-putting and you didn't read social cues. And here's what happened to this part of your brain when you were a third trimester fetus to explain that. I haven't made much headway in how do you find meaning and purpose out of this like big indifferent mechanistic universe, but I'm lucky as hell to have gotten to spend 50 years sitting and like ruminating on it because I'm one of the lucky ones. Nobody ever told me it's my fault that I wound up in poverty. Nobody ever told me any of those things. So Yeah, like I'm not very useful for like where and how you pull any like purpose out of all of this and how this doesn't lead one to be despairing as hell. But that's just because I've been lucky. I can sit around and do stuff like that. And my guess is anyone who on a Sunday afternoon could sit around listening to stuff like this is in that category as well. If we can think about this stuff, we're the lucky ones. We're not worrying about where we're going to get clean water from or
Hmm.
something like that. And that much worse if someone concludes that somehow it's our own damn fault if we got born into a culture that didn't educate us or
Hmm.
knows what. So I don't know. That's my rant about all of this.
So would you say that embracing determinism would ultimately optimize empathy?
Yeah,
Yeah.
uh, massively. Because if you follow through the logical implications of this, like really, really work with this, not only does blame and punishment never make any sense, and not only does praise and reward never make any sense, but none of us have earned anything. The word deserve is irrational. The notion of justice being served is irrational. None of it makes any sense whatsoever. And among other things, one result of that is hating somebody makes as little sense as hating a virus that's good at getting into your lung cells. That's just how it turned out. Nonetheless, we got to protect people's lungs and we got to protect society from people who turned out to be dangerous. And we got to find ways to motivate people who are going to turn out to be good at taking brain tumors out of people's brains. And we got to solve all those problems. But none of us have earned anything. None of us have our needs that are any more deserving than anyone else's. And that said, like, and I've been thinking this way for half a century, blah, blah. That said, I can function that way like for 3.5 minutes once every 2 months. Yeah, this isn't going to be easy. like, oh, you get pissed off at somebody. How'd they turn out this way? How did Vladimir Putin wind up being who he is? How did, any of those? Or someone says to me, oh, nice shirt. And like, oh, how do I like deconstruct the 2.5 seconds afterward of thinking, oh, well, I've got an amazing taste in shirts. Look at this. I'm a more deserving human of getting vaccines and like sufficient vitamins, and my kids surviving. And like, yeah, you got to fight through it. Um, and again, I've been thinking this way forever, and I can act morally and reflexively on that every now and then for a few seconds before like I fall back into my cultural time and place. But you got to push against it.
Yeah. Um, do you ever indulge in the illusion of free will? Like, does it ever make sense to do that?
Um, yeah, when I'm tired, when I'm cranky, when I'm stressed, when I'm hungry, when I'm feeling self-indulgent or and okay, we can't do this all the time, but like at least fight your way to this kind of viewpoint when it comes to a point where you're making a judgment about somebody else. Um, I mean, just always have this rule in your head that if you think you understand why someone just did what they did, you're almost certainly wrong.
Hmm.
And so, like, okay, you don't want to do that as to why this person, in front of you in line at the Starbucks just leaned to their left when they sneezed instead of leaning to their right. Okay, you know what? If you want to go with free will on that, that's fine. Be a good house guest. Tell the person you love the dinner they made, even though it has to do with like their olfactory receptors in their nose and mechanistic stuff like that. But when it comes to like actually judging stuff, that's where you got to put the effort into it. Because when I was a kid, it was intuitively obvious that some kids had trouble learning to read because they were lazy and unmotivated.
Hmm.
Somebody had to fight against those assumptions enough to produce a 40-year literature on how the mechanistic basis of that. And if it was 60 years ago, it was intuitively obvious that if somebody had schizophrenia, it was because their mother psychodynamically hated them. And hundreds of thousands of mothers of people with schizophrenia were taught throughout the first 3/4 of the last century that schizophrenia is caused by schizophrenogenic mothering. And people pushed against that enough with the neurochemistry and stuff in the 70s to completely liberate all those people who had been told by every expert, it's your fault. It's because you unconsciously hated your child and wished they hadn't been born. You made them schizophrenic. And you go and at every one of those, and no, you didn't have epilepsy because you were sleeping with Satan. You got like screwed up potassium channels in this part of your brain. So you got to push at every one of those. It's, for about the last dozen years, kind of as this hobby. I work with a lot of public defenders' offices on murder trials where, like, my specialty is somebody who has like a brain so screwed up by like everything going wrong for them from the time they were like 4 cells of a after fertilization and thereafter, that you cannot remotely hold them accountable for the concept of they could have made a choice in those 6 seconds to do otherwise. So going through that, and like that's been kind of a fun, interesting hobby. It's been thoroughly unsuccessful. Like 11 out of the 13 cases I've worked on, we've lost. So like that's been, but a couple of years ago, I got contacted by the public defenders working on a case of a guy who took an automatic weapon and first tried to burn down a mosque, and that didn't work, and then went into a synagogue and shot a whole bunch of people, um, killed one of them. And like, could I work with them on that? And like, holy shit, like my family, they were all in the camps, and I grew up obsessed with that. And if I believe any of this crap I'm spouting, I better be able to say, yes, I'll work on this. And like, I futzed around neurotically for a few days and saying, how can I weasel out of this? And saying, if this stuff is, I got to work on this. And I signed on. And thank God the guy plea bargained life without parole instead of the death penalty. So it never turned into a case that like I had to work on. But yeah, if I really believe this stuff, and nonetheless, if right after that happened, I was dimly aware of that one of the news that occurred in Southern California, and like that Monday, if I was listening to NPR and they were saying, "Oh, the shooter at the massacre was arraigned this morning, and we will know by later today if they will also be charged with federal hate crimes, and if they're suitable for that, they're subject to the death penalty," I would have felt, "Yeah, fry the bastard, that son of a bitch!" And then, oh, okay, wait. I don't believe stuff like that. And like, if I really don't believe stuff like that, I should be willing to work on this case. If I want to get irritated at somebody who cuts me off in traffic and decide that they are Satan's child or something, that's okay. As long as when the big ones come around, including the big ones where I feel like I've earned something, like then I feel like I should do the hard work, but it's an uphill battle.
Hmm. Do you envision a future where the majority of people embrace a deterministic worldview, or will this be a debate in the academic community for a long time, do you think?
No, it's fairly consequential. And like, it's a very different world when old ladies without teeth aren't burned at the stake anymore when the weather turned bad or somebody's child got smallpox or something. Like, these things have consequences. But I think what has sort of sustained me, um, is, we've done this over and over and over throughout history. We figured out areas where there is no volition. Somebody cannot be blamed for some behavior because they have epilepsy, they have major depression, they have dyslexia. Each one of these has been a milepost of, in every one of those cases, the roof hasn't collapsed on society and the world has in fact become more humane. And, we kind of keep doing it.
Hmm.
Somewhere in the last 20 years, something shifted. So the majority of Americans have decided that if you love somebody of the same sex that you are, this is not a choice. This is a biological. Like there's been a shift with that. We may be, I don't know, maybe 10 years away from the majority opinion in the country being some people wind up having brains where they feel as if they are the opposite sex of what their chromosomes, gonads, hormones. Yeah, we're not there yet when you look at the incidence of hate crime. So yeah, some of these are happening, and we just need to keep pushing in that direction because each one gets better, and we do it in little ways. I mean, we do. Your 5-year-old has a nose cold, and you can constrain their behavior, acting on deterministic principles. You keep them home from kindergarten tomorrow because they're going to sneeze on all the other kids and get sick. And the rule is, please, if your child is sneezing, keep them home until they're better. And you constrain their behavior, but you don't tell your kid you've got a rotten soul and that's why you're sneezing and that's why you can't play with your toys while you're at home. Cars brakes stop working, people start sneezing, people turn out to have trouble regulating their behavior because they went through every conceivable type of trauma, and thus a part of the brain that does self-regulation is really crappy in them. And like that's how it turned out, and act accordingly. And like you don't go in, the car whose brakes aren't working, like you put it in the garage because it's dangerous, you have to protect society from it, but you don't go in there every day with a sledgehammer and hit the hood of the car because it's got a rotten soul and become dangerous to society. Like yeah, constrain people minimally, motivate people sufficiently, but do it all in a mechanistic, instrumental way without any damn preaching anywhere along the way, and put lots of effort into figuring out how some people turn out to be damaging and how other people turn out to have great potential for taking out brain tumors or writing wonderful symphonies, and learn how to, tilt society in a direction where this outcome becomes more likely than outcome. It's a public health model.
Hmm.
Like you do the minimal to make people safe from somebody who is infectiously dangerous because of something they had no control over. You don't constrain them a smidgen more than that. You don't preach to them in the process. And you put effort into understanding the root causes of how some people wind up being that way and why some people wind up being really good poets and how can we make for more of them.
Hmm. Gotcha. Um, so I have one more question before I pivot to questions from my members. What can be done to advance the acceptance of determinism, particularly in areas like the legal system and ethics?
Well, unfortunately, the only logical extension of any of this in the realm of like the criminal justice system is it makes no sense whatsoever. It is intellectually and ethically indefensible to view the notion that there is anything other than horror to the notion of retribution, of justice being served, of anything other than a constraint model. None of it makes any sense at all. And um, it's going to have to be unrecognizably different. Maybe again, the baby steps start off with like realize that some people can post bail more readily than others because they were born into wealth and and this person doesn't have a cent to their name, and that's why they're going to be locked up for 3 years before they even come to trial, and then discover that the evidence against them was like mostly fabricated or okay. So we got to do like a baby step version of revolutionary change needed. But yeah, every now and then, wow, we've pulled it off. Most Americans think it's gay marriage is okay. Most Americans believe there's a thing called dyslexia. Most Americans by now believe mental illness is a neurochemical disorder rather than a moral fail. Yeah, it works out now and then, some of the time really fast. Some of the time really fast. I suspect in those cases catalyzed so much more so by having the right celebrity come down with some disease or disorder or the right atypical sort of taste in life or whatever. That does it so much more than like 100,000 neuroscientists locked up with their rats coming up with factoids about this. I mean, that's where the societal change. When did America stop believing that mothers cause schizophrenia and instead it's a neurological disorder? It was on one afternoon in 1988 on the Phil Donahue show, where Phil Donahue had, I think, a niece or something with schizophrenia that he never talked about, but he was very, very like concerned about this, and this was one of his, and he brought on the guy who most recently had discovered the first brain imaging of people with schizophrenia rather than waiting to get their brains out and put it in a vat, showing you show a picture of a brain of somebody with schizophrenia, somebody without, and you can see there's a structural difference. Stuff looks different. He put up those two pictures, and that's the day that it all changed. This
Hmm.
organization called NAMI, and National Association for the Mentally Ill, which mostly was an organization of mothers of people with schizophrenia who had spent, they got 80,000 letters in the week afterward from people who watch us. Why did that happen? Phil Donahue has a niece. It's like people in my business would sit around and pray, please let some really powerful Republican senator have a family member come down with the disease that I study, because suddenly there's going to be much more funding for it than there was before. Like, those are the catalysts. So you just hope lightning strikes in those sorts of ways. But yeah, we're not getting rid of the criminal justice system soon. We're not getting rid of meritocracy soon.
Mhm.
And, you know, instead of all reform undercutting revolution, you got to pretend you just had a little baby micro revolution with each one of these steps. So it feels like this is moving in the right direction instead of just apologetics or something.
Mhm. Gotcha. So I'm going to move to questions from our community. I've got these questions in advance, so I'm going to start with Annemiek. Um, Annemiek says, I learned that my total is influenced by factors such as what I've eaten, drank, and the chances I had at the start of my life, even at conception. But if everything is determined, how is it that I was able to break free from deeply ingrained family patterns?
Okay, that's the uh-oh. If you say there's no free will, does that mean nothing can change? So don't bother. No, stuff changes. Stuff changes dramatically. People change in ways that are like beyond heartwarming or horrifying. I mean, there's ex-white supremacists out there. Cultures change, all of that. The critical thing is the way this is reconcilable with there being no free will is we do not change. We do not choose to change. We are changed. We are changed by circumstance as a function of who we turned out to be in that moment.
Mhm.
And once you get that mindset, one can identify in this questionnaire, I don't know, at some point they had an inspirational teacher. At some point they decided somebody was totally cool. At some point the rock band they listened to, the lead singer turned out to have advocate this or that and they became a vegan. At some point, like at some point they lucked out enough to have a respect for introspection and thus thinking about maybe this isn't working for me. At some point, they lucked out and wound up with the sort of ego where they would be willing to admit this isn't working for me. I need to do something different. This doesn't work. who knows what. One of these just came along. I mean, you get two people. What was that movie? Hotel Rwanda,
Mm,
about the Rwandan genocide. Incredibly moving, and that heroic guy and all of that. And you get two people who go in to watch the movie and they sit next to each other and they come out changed by the movie. One of them comes out changed with new intentions in life. That person says, "Oh my God, that was the most inspirational movie. I'm going to go give my life savings now to Doctors Without Borders and spend the rest of my life devoted." And the other person comes out changed by it, saying, "Oh my God, that was the crappiest cinematography ever. I'm going to devote the rest of my life to hunting down the cinematographer and assassinating the person." Whoa, they were changed by their experiences. They were changed as a function of they turned out to be very different people going into it.
mhm,
So, yeah, somewhere your questioner lucked out and wound up being somebody who had the ability to understand where some of the buttons and levers were in the biological machine that they are, and to be able to act upon that based on empowerment from previous examples. Ooh, they can do that. That inspires me to do that. They lucked out.
mm,
That's how it turned out for them.
gotcha. Um, I'm going to move to Ashita's question. Says, I am curious to hear what you think about outliers. For instance, individuals like Barack Obama, who grew up in not ideal circumstances, yet overcame a difficult upbringing to attend Ivy League colleges and become president, or those who grow up with abuse yet are able to break the cycle, or even those who fall victim to abuse despite ideal upbringings.
Yeah. What do we do with the exceptions? Because that's that's one of the real magnets for deciding there's free will there, because it's spectacular when you see those exceptions. You know, we just finished the Olympics. When I was a kid, there was this runner named Wilma Rudolph who, like in 1964, was the fastest woman on earth. And not only did she grow up with like in segregated South, not only did she grow up with a sharecropper parents with 14 siblings, but she had polio. She had polio. She had leg braces when she was a kid, and she decided she was going to work through it and power. And when I was a kid, I loved her. I thought she was the most Oh my God. She just fought through the pain. And after a while, didn't need leg braces, and after a while was the fastest woman on earth. And oh my God, I don't know how she turned out that way, but that's not because she was made of different stuff inside there than the rest of us. She had the right role models at various points. She had the right quirky thing that happened that made her feel empowered, that, ooh, I should be able to do that as well. She had like the right teacher who spotted some potential in her. She had who knows what. And the same thing when you look at like the child of some Silicon Valley mogul who, by the time they're in 11th grade, they're already in rehab.
Hmm.
Do they have a rotten self-indulgent they just squandered on? No, something went wrong there also. It's not by chance they turned out that way. The outliers just are the ones where we don't understand yet where that came from.
Um, I'm going to move to Stephen's question. Stephen says, considering the complexity and variability of systems like decision making, which involves learning, reinforcement, and even forgetting, how can we assert that thought and action are entirely involuntary, and does it ultimately matter?
Well, this is okay. So we're threading a fine line, double-edged sword or whatever here, in that at any given moment, no, the future is not already determined. Every event was not already in place 2 minutes after the Big Bang. There are multiple possible futures
Mhm.
because of chaoticism and nonlinearity and all of that. So everything is not already set in that sense. Um, but it needs to be reconciled that we will be working with that within the parameters of who we turned out to be. Um, in the moment where we have a conscious sense of intent, I'm going to choose vanilla instead of strawberry. At that point, there are multiple possible futures. Something can happen so that it turned out that all the vanilla stuff melted last night because some spark plug went off in the freezer or who knows what. And oh, it's a different outcome because of stuff you had no control over. Nonetheless, at that juncture, the momentness of us having intent just feels so seductively as if in that moment, whatever neuron in there just did that, did that free of its history.
Hmm,
And it can't be, it can never be.
gotcha. Um, I'm going to move to Josephina's question. The question is, did Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov influence any of your thoughts regarding free will?
Um, yes, in the form of trying to negate everything that he was saying in there. I can't remember which the brother who turned out to be the nihilistic one who said, if there is no God, everything is allowed. Which is another version of like a non secular version of like, oh, if there's no free will, nobody can hold me responsible for my actions, just run amok.
Hmm,
No, that can't be the answer. You gotta find meaning somewhere. Um, and like everything can't be allowed because the way we're wired up, we have a ingrained neurobiology of feeling empathy for other people in pain.
mhm,
Everyone selectively filtered by all sorts of suspect criteria that are questionable, blah, blah. But humans have a propensity towards that. We evolved that way. We have a propensity towards preferring cooperation in some settings over than others. It would be an uphill battle for somebody to truly function as if there's no God and there's no free will, everything is allowed. Um,
mhm,
Dostoevsky maybe, but not in reality.
mhm. Gotcha. Um, and so I'm going to move to Liejing's question. He said, why do you think most thinkers take a position different from that in your book?
Um, again, if I want to get all snarky and stuff, um, it's because it's like pretty demoralizing in many ways, unless you really stop and reflect on how you wound up where you are. Otherwise, it's pretty demoralizing to decide there's no free will and it's this huge, indifferent, empty universe and all of that. And I think there's a certain fuel that goes into a lot of these very smart philosophers nonetheless making egregious logic errors at some point or other in their sequence where they decide they have just found that there still is free will. Um,
Mhm,
why did I, like, ooh, I'm so self-congratulatory. Whoa, how did I turn out to be able to face the truth that most people can't? How am I able to like lick truth's sweaty armpits and nobody else or whatever? It, oh, where my head was at when I was 14 had a lot to do with it, and it's had a lot to do with sort of what my wiring is like.
mhm,
Um, I don't know. I have a predilection for like being able to tolerate a fair degree of despair. Like, that's how I turned out. So I can be that way and still write books, or
mhm.
I can be that way and still like get out of bed in the morning. That's how it turned out.
Yeah. And then I'm going to move to Amelia's question. She said, do you have any further predictions for what a societal shift towards determinism would look like, particularly for a society preoccupied with punishment and revenge?
Um, I feel fairly confident it will get better. because baby steps and all of that going on. It will just be more domains in which we understand how, with a couple of neurotransmitter hiccups or something, I could have been them and things would have been reversed. Um, it would be with a little more understanding of how much we operate on irrationality and viscera, and then try to post hoc decide that that was actually being logical. Um, it's mostly seeing it's gotten better. I've like what was one really fun chapter to research on sort of the history of how people have been executed since like the 12th century. And at every step, you know, it's gotten less savage
Hmm.
and less visceral and less like spittle flecked peasants ripping off somebody's limbs with four horses and quarter. And at each one of those, people have gotten better with it. And we are comfortable now with the notion that sometimes justice being served is this person is in prison and they're not going to get to have Christmas with their kids this year. And maybe they'll think about what they did and that will shape their subsequent behavior. We've gotten to the point of that rather than like ripping off somebody's limbs and pouring molten lead on the remnants of it and using pincers or this, and while the whole crowd village stands around fighting to get a good view. The last public hanging in the United States was in the 1930s, and 20,000 people turned out to watch it. And they sold lemonade there. They sold souvenirs. When the guy was hung, part of the crowd rushed him to pull off pieces of the cape, the shroud that they put on him. I don't know why I find this meaningful, but this is Johnny Depp's hometown, which is where the last public hanging took place. Um, and you know, stuff changes. We're gonna get there, and it seems intuitively obvious to us now that some people are not by their nature meant for slavery and that you're doing them a favor. But we could have been the same, like nice, reflective liberals that we are now. And if it was 300 years ago, it would have made sense. You know, some people are just that way. And we figured out like it is now intuitively obvious that it's not good to have like 6-year-olds work to death in textile factories. Whereas it would have seemed intuitively obvious somewhere back when that that was okay for some people's kids. Stuff that seems intuitively obvious now about where we make judgments and stuff, um, somewhere in the future, it's going to seem as absurd as thinking that like animals don't have feelings, so it's okay if some, plowsman beats his horse to death or something. Nah, that 19th century, most of Western Europe decided that was not okay anymore, and animals were not just senseless machines. Oh, they have feelings. Not a good thing anymore.
Hmm.
So it's just gonna have to be stepwise with that. I mean, I've got an area where I need to like overcome some of my reflexes about volition and stuff. I teach a class and I hand out grades at the end, which I have great ambivalence about because like, how do we turn out this way? And, but I get past that. But I've got this horrible bias in there, which is, I teach a class and sitting in there in the seminar, some of these Stanford students are ones where they just get it. You're telling people about something and you see in their eyes they got it 2 minutes before everybody. They write papers that are they're already thinking at this incredible high level, and that is so cool and exciting, all of that. But the kids who I really want to have in there are the ones who like they don't have those natural, they're not getting it immediately, but damn, they're working hard in there. And let me find a way to push their B plus to an A minus and decide, let me finish. because my intuition is that somehow the kids who are working very hard, that is more praiseworthy than the kids who just happen to get born. You know, if you think about it, that's as egregious as saying that mothers cause schizophrenia. Yeah, that's an area I got to kind of overcome that. It seems I got to fight the sense that it's intuitively obvious that the kids in there who worked harder, yeah, find a way to push them over this side because they've been, man, their first papers, they were so, look how far they've come, and you can tell they've
Mm.
been working hard, as opposed to this kid who just, yeah, they get it. They get it. Their brain, that's not really okay that that's a bias that I have. That's one that I somehow have to overcome.
Mm.
Yeah. So little steps. I may never be able to overcome that one, but at least I don't think people should be burned at the stake when the weather turns bad. So, you win some, you lose some.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I have two final questions. The first one is if we wanted to delve into another book from your extensive body of work, which one would you recommend we explore next?
Oh, if you're really like a glutton for like the nuts and bolts of how all this stuff works, behave.
Hmm.
It's like chapter one is somebody does something or other and it's wonderful or it's terrible or it's in the eye of the beholder. Chapter two is what went on in their brain a second ago.
Mm.
Chapter three is what went on in the environment 5 minutes ago. Chapter and just marching back through that. And like if you like biology, you know, go for that one. Otherwise, I don't know. This book of mine, a primate's memoir, part of what my research over the years been over the years is I spent 33 summers studying wild baboons in East Africa. So it's a book about sort of my time there, and it's got essentially zero science in it. So it's got like some nice animal stories. So if biology, you don't want to go near that. I don't know. I
Very
like
cool.
that other book.
Very cool. Um, what and so my second question is what are you currently working on and what can we look forward to from you in the near future?
Um, Well, I'm in that stage that I sort of recognize by now where I feel absolutely clear that I'm never going to write anything again and I don't have the concentration or memory or whatever, and I've my best years are behind me, and this comes after each book.
Hmm.
Um, the next one might be that I realize, like in this determined book, and it's all this pages in there, there's a word I literally only use the word once in there, and I'm so embarrassed now at how like it should have. I used the word meritocracy in there once,
Hmm.
and you know solving the criminal justice system and its inequities, and the fact that you have to completely get rid of it and have a society in which dangerous people are kept from being damaging to other people, yet there's no moral worth attached to anything with that, that it's going to be even harder to do to the flip side, that there's something desperately wrong with like you take a 17-year-old and you tell me their history, and I probably have like 98% accuracy in predicting, are they going to wind up in my classroom at Stanford, or are they going to wind up in the East Palo Alto Juvenile Detention Center? And like, okay, we got to do. So it's easy. How do we constrain people from being dangerous without moralizing their problems? How do we motivate people to like not go out to yet another party on Saturday night while their roommate is and study instead because we really want them to become a good neurosurgeon? How do you do that without attaching an inflated sense of moral worth coming out the other end? So I realize now in retrospect, I just chickened out like literally one sentence where I said, like in the last chapter, and yeah, and all of this applies to meritocracy also. Damn, that's going to be so much harder than just getting rid of the entire criminal justice system. And that's going to be trivial in comparison with how do we get people to put in the considerable effort that's needed to become competent at something that will benefit a lot of people without telling them that as a result they deserve to be able to cut in line closer to the front. So I don't know, maybe that's the next one, but right now all I want to do is like catch up on my sleep or something, and it seems inconceivable that I'll ever write anything again. So
Yeah,
that's where my head's at this point.
gotcha. Well, I would hope you would write that book, but yeah. All right. So, Dr. Sapolsky, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. Your work continues to challenge and inspire us, and Determined is a thought-provoking addition to the ongoing conversation about human behavior and free will. We appreciate your time and look forward to seeing how your ideas influence future discussions.
Well, thanks for having me on. Thanks for all you guys sitting here for the last hour or whatever. Glad you did. I don't know. Good luck, everyone. Take care.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed our interview with Robert Sapolsky, author of Determined. We certainly did. You can join us online for free. Just search Science Book Club on Facebook. Thanks for listening. See you next time.